Amen. You may be seated. I hope that's your prayer today. It's that song is just perfect for where we're going in the sermon today, because we're talking about a people that needed God to change them from the inside out, and they lived thousands of years ago. We're no different, living today. And when you think about those words and what it is that you've just sung as a prayer to God, it is a daunting thing and a scary thing and an awesome thing when God does that work. If you were with us last week, we were in week 4 of our series through Joshua, and we talked a lot about God's faithfulness. He had delivered the children of Israel out of the 40 years that they were wandering in the wilderness, brought them through the Jordan River in this miraculous way, told them he wanted them to build an altar, some stones of remembrance to remember his faithfulness. And we talked about why that's important, what's that all about, and how can we live as people today who remember the faithfulness of God, and some modern day stones of remembrance that we can do. God showed incredible mercy to the children of Israel. Did they deserve it? No, they didn't deserve it. Do you and I deserve it when God shows us mercy? Not really. We are all people, the Bible tells us, who fall short of God's standard time and time again. The New Testament author, Paul, said, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." He said, "The wages of sin is death." That's what we deserve for the way that we've lived our life. But God, in his great mercy, has given us a gift. And it says, "But the gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord." I love grace. I love it when it's shown to me. I love when I get to show it to other people, because it's a reflection of what God has done in my life. And I tell you, it is just a beautiful thing to experience on both ends of that equation. Billy Graham, years ago, was riding through a town, and believe it or not, even pastors speed, and he got pulled over for speeding. And so this famous evangelist is told that he needs to go to court in this small town, and he goes and comes back to where he was doing his crusade, or on his way to the crusade, and he stands before the judge, and the judge asked Billy Graham what he asked everybody else in the courtroom that day: guilty or not guilty? And Graham pled guilty. And he had been speeding 10 miles over the speed limit, and so the judge said, "All right, that's going to be $10, $1 for every mile you went over the limit." Man, I wish it was still that way. Wouldn't that be great if that's how it was? I've never been shown grace like that. But suddenly the judge recognized who was standing before him and realized it's, Billy Graham. And he was still pretty young at the time. And he says, "Reverend Graham, you have violated the law. The fine must be paid, but I'm going to pay it for you." And he pulls out his big wallet, and he takes a $10 bill out from his wallet, and he takes the speeding ticket, and he staples it to the ticket. And then he takes Billy Graham out for a steak dinner that night. And that, Billy Graham would write in one of his books, is how God treats repentant sinners. And when you think about it, it really is. I mean, he's the one, and way beyond that, who for our sin forsook himself, went to the cross, took on our sin, became sin, paid the price for us, and gives us way more than a steak dinner. Well, there was something beautiful happening with the Israelites on the occasion of their entry into the Promised Land. Not only had they experienced God's grace, but they were experiencing the promises of God come true. I mean, that's why the Promised Land is called the Promised Land. Hundreds of years before, God had promised to Abraham that he was going to make a great nation out of him, and he had promised him this land, and God had come through. They were spending their first hours in the Promised Land. There were some other amazing things that were happening here. There were many who had just built these stones of remembrance to remember the faithfulness of God, who no doubt were reflecting upon that. For 40 years, God had sustained these people. For 40 years in an incredibly harsh wilderness. So harsh were the conditions in that wilderness that they couldn't grow their own agriculture because there wasn't enough water to do so. So they couldn't grow their food. And so you remember how God fed them. Every day, this manna comes from heaven, and we told you a couple weeks ago, manna literally means, what is it? So what is it would come, and God would feed them with what is it every day, and they were sustained by God's own hand. Water that wasn't in abundance in that wilderness for growing was also not in abundance for drinking, and yet God would bring them to these oases, and there would be enough water to feed all, or for all the people to drink. There wasn't enough water to take care of livestock, and yet God somehow allowed these animals to live as well that they had taken with them. And now the people had crossed over into the promised land. Now, way back in the book of Deuteronomy, God told the people why it was that he was going to make them wander in this wilderness for 40 years. And some people say, why was God so harsh on them? Well, let's let God speak for himself here. Deuteronomy 8:2-3 says this, "And you shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. And he humbled you, and he let you hunger and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of God." Any of you who know the story of Jesus know that those are verses that Jesus would quote thousands of years later as he's being tested by the devil in, of all places, the wilderness. Well, God has been preparing the Israelites for the taking of the promised land by preparing them spiritually. They needed to come to the point where they recognized that every gift that they had in their life came from the Lord. They needed to come to the point where they lived their life in dependence upon him. In a sense, the 40 years that they spent in the wilderness was a type of spiritual boot camp. You see, there was one generation who had all of the marks of a follower of Jehovah. They looked like his chosen people, but their hearts were incredibly far from God, who was being replaced now by an entire generation of people who had none of the marks of those who were followers of Jehovah, but whose hearts were pursuing him. And that's what Joshua chapter 5 is about. It's about a people who are about to encounter some unbelievable instruction from the Lord to kind of give them one final lesson in the boot camp before they go off into battle. Look at Joshua 5:1. When all the Amorite kings west of the Jordan and all the Canaanite kings who lived along the Mediterranean coast heard how the Lord had dried up the Jordan River so the people of Israel could cross, they lost heart and were paralyzed with fear because of them. See what's going on? Word is spreading across the ancient Near East world about how the God of the Israelites is acting once again on their behalf. And these pagan kings are absolutely scared to death. Fear is the best description of what is gripping them at this time. And if I'm one of those Israelites and God has commanded me to take the promised land, this, I've got to believe, is the time. This is the time to strike. Strike while the iron is hot. I mean, we've got people here, kings of other lands, who are paralyzed with fear. Victory was all but assured. This must be the time, but God's boot camp wasn't over. God doesn't always work in the way that we expect him to, does he? I mean, I think if I were to just stop the sermon right now and say, why don't you all just begin to tell me situations in your life where God didn't quite work on your time frame or in the way that you expected him to work in your life, we could sit here for hours. I mean, we could hear about adoptions that we wish would have been done a year ago. We could hear about jobs that we thought for sure that we were going to get that we didn't get. We could hear about you name it. Every one of us have those situations in life. You know, Isaiah wrote about this in Isaiah 55:8-9. He said, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." And I am so glad to know that that's what God reveals to us about himself. Because so many of us, I think, can say intellectually, we know that's true. We know that God's ways aren't like our ways. And at times it bothers us, and at times we even have the audacity to think that we know better than God. If God would just do things my way, things would look a lot better. But God's plans and his ways are so much higher than ours. Have you ever experienced God working in your life that way? Of course you have. And many of you can look back on it and say, you know what? In the midst of the storm, I thought, God, have you gone mad? And in the end, what God did is showed his faithfulness. So God gives Joshua, in the next verse, some unexpected instruction. At that time, the Lord told Joshua, make flint knives and circumcise this second generation of Israelites. So Joshua made flint knives and circumcised the entire male population of Israel at Gibeah Harloth. Now, I want to stop there. Every man in the room just cringed, all right? If they didn't cringe, they had fallen asleep at that point in the sermon. I mean, it's one of those passages that we just quickly pass through in Scripture without really thinking about what it's saying. But when you stop to think about what God has just commanded Joshua to do, you have to cringe. I mean, if I was there, I think I would have said, stop the presses, Joshua. You have heard God wrong. There is no way that God said that, and there is no way that you're coming anywhere near me with a flint knife. All right, just get away. I don't want anything to do with this. And that just proves how little my Western mind understands about the significance of this command. Now remember, the mark of circumcision was unique to the Hebrew people. A few days after a male baby was born, he was circumcised, and he bore the mark then of God's covenant people as a Hebrew boy. Somewhere along the line, the generation of Hebrews who had left Egypt stopped circumcising their son. One writer's put it this way. He says, the author of the book of Numbers was a time of great unbelief and judgment. By the way, read the book of Numbers if you haven't read that in a little while. I know many people think that Numbers is just about numbers, right? It's just about, all the tribes and keeping the numbers. There are some of the greatest stories in the Old Testament that are contained in the book of Numbers. But it's also this heartbreaking book because it's this book about the constant and the continual disobedience of God's covenant people. He writes, God waited patiently 40 years for the original Exodus generation to die in the wilderness because of their rebellion. The subsequent generation, for one reason or another, did not experience all the sacraments that identified them as God's people. Whether these sacraments were withdrawn by God or ignored by Israel is not clear. What is clear is that the generation that came out of Egypt had all of the observable marks of the faithful, but lacked the proper heart response. Do you catch that? Is that ever a description of us? Do we ever look like those who are faithful to God on the outside? Well, we don't look like it in the inside. He goes on to say this, by grace then, God raises up a new generation in their place, their children, led by Joshua. The writer makes a clear distinction between the old and the new generation, between the shame of the parents who failed to persevere in their faith and the hope of the children who would persevere. As a mark of God's faithfulness to his promises, Joshua is commanded to circumcise the males, some of whom would have been around 40 years old. The pain of the circumcision not only identifies the Israelites as God's chosen, but they have entered the land. It symbolizes a completion of the redemption from Egypt, which started in Exodus 3:8. God kept his promise. And I know that there are many today who are scared to death about the next generation of believers. And what about those who are 29 or under? Are they going to faithfully follow Jesus? There have been books after book after book that have been written about this generation. And I believe that God is ready to do such a work of revival in his church. And so many of those who have walked away from church saying, we walked away because we saw people who lived one way in front of a bunch of Christians and another way the rest of the week. We weren't sure if this faith really made a difference at all. That's a hard thing to hear. It's hard when we're accused of hypocrisy. In Joshua's day and age, these children could very well have said, our parents were hypocrites. They had all the marks of a follower of Jehovah, but their hearts were far from him, and that would have been an accurate statement. And so God says, listen, I want to do a new work in you. I want to do a work in your generation. So your parents forgot the sacrament. So your parents stopped following those things. That doesn't mean that you can't come back to me. And you know what's amazing to me is there was no protesting here from this new generation of Israelites. All we see recorded from the text is obedience. Verse 3 tells us that Joshua circumcised the entire male population of Israel, and the story continues in verse 4. Joshua explains it here, had to circumcise them because all the men who were old enough to fight in battle when they left Egypt had died in the wilderness. Those who left Egypt had all been circumcised, but none of those born after the Exodus during the years in the wilderness had been circumcised. The Israelites had traveled in the wilderness for 40 years until all the men who were old enough to fight in battle when they left Egypt had died. For they had disobeyed the Lord, and the Lord vowed that he would not let them enter the land that he had sworn to give to us, a land flowing with milk and honey. So Joshua circumcised their sons, those who had grown up to take their fathers' places, for they had not been circumcised on their way to the promised land. After all the males had been circumcised, they rested in the camp until they were healed. Circumcision was not only a sign that the people were God's chosen people, it was a sign of obedience. This might seem so strange in our day and age, but God was essentially preparing his army for the spiritual battles that they were going into. Circumcision was, I told you, a command that God gave to the children of Israel. It actually began in Genesis 17, 9 through 11. After God told Abraham, Abraham, I'm going to make a great nation out of you. The very first command he gave to Abraham was this command of circumcision. And God said to Abraham, as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. Do you understand why God made this covenant? It was so the Israelites would renew their covenant with him, this new covenant that he's doing with this new generation of Israelites. Why he's commanding them to do this is so that they would renew their covenant with him. They were required to remove from their bodies a piece of flesh as a sign that they were part of the covenant. Robert Jones says, so too we must remove from our lives anything that stands between us and total surrender to the Lord. Circumcision was to be the outward reminder of an inward work of faith. Anything that is displeasing to the Lord needs to be removed from your life. It needs to be cut off and put away from you forever. But it really is this incredible visual image of the fact that we've got stuff in our life that needs to be cut away. It might have seemed like an extreme move because Israel at this point is at a crossroads, aren't they? They're moving from this 40-year wilderness wandering where they have been in total dependence upon God for their very survival, for the food that they would eat. They crossed the Jordan River. They are now in the promised land. And it could have been that they felt, as they crossed that Jordan River, built these stones of remembrance, hey, we're living the dream. This is what we have dreamt about for our entire lives. We have finally crossed into the promised land. God's told us wherever we put our feet in this land that he's going to deliver it to us as long as we're faithful to him. We got it all together here. We don't need God like we used to need him. It could have been that they felt that way as they came into the promised land. But God wanted them to remember that they would need him every hour. They would need him. That God waited until they were in enemy territory to command circumcision is really an incredible thing, too. I mean, why didn't God say before they crossed the Jordan River, before they were in the land of the enemy, you know what, let's take care of this circumcision thing right now. Before you walk into enemy territory, let's take care of this. We don't want you in a vulnerable position as you're in this foreign land. But no, God commands it after they've entered into the promised land. And he'd already taken care of them. Verse 1 tells us he'd already put fear in the eyes of the pagan kings. They were going to be okay. They didn't know that. They had no idea how the rest of the people around the promised land felt about them. But what they found out was that obedience to God, as difficult as it was, would come with God taking care of them. They needed this time in God's boot camp. Some of you have been in boot camp before. Chuck Swindoll describes his own boot camp experience this way. He says, there we stood, an unorganized ragtag bunch of 70 or so young men at that Marine boot camp. Young men of every conceivable size and background thrown together in a strange place, having no idea, thankfully, what was ahead of us. During the months that followed, every shred of self-sufficient arrogance, every hint of independent spirit, and all thought of rebellion was scraped away. Any indifference toward authority was replaced by a firm commitment to do only as we were told, regardless. We learn to survive in the crucible of intense extreme training that has characterized the Marine Corps through its proud and proven history. The disciplined regimen of boot camp, day after day, week after week, brought about remarkable changes in each one of us. And as a result, we left that place completely different than when we arrived. The isolation of our location, the absence of all soft creature comforts, the relentless, monotonous drills and demanding repetition of inspections, the tests that followed that forced us to encounter the unknown without showing fear, all mixed with the maddening determination and constant harassment of our drill instructor, yielded powerful dividends. Almost without realizing it, while learning to submit ourselves to the commands of our leader, we ultimately found ourselves physically fit, emotionally stirred, and mentally ready for whatever conflict might come our way, even the harsh reality of facing the enemy in combat. See, that's what God had spent the last 40 years doing in the lives of the Israelites. They wouldn't be completely ready until they'd finished this final test. Their obedience by going through the circumcision and resting in enemy territory until they were healed proved their confidence in God. They may not have understood it at the time, but their battles in the future weren't going to be won because Israel had some superior army. It wasn't going to be won because Israel had such superior numbers or battle prowess or weapons. They were going to be won because of their faith in God. Such was the way with Israel. Generations later, King David, Israel's warrior king, would write in Psalm 20, verse 7, "Some trust in chariots, some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God." Do you? Do you trust in him? Do you trust that God is big enough to take you through your trial? Do you trust that God is big enough to take care of your children? Do you trust that God is big enough to help you with the conflict in your life? Do you trust that God can truly save someone like you? Do you trust God? Because if you don't, chances are that your boot camp is going to continue. Because we need to come to the point of trust before God can truly use us. We need to be able to give up something of ourselves. In Galatians 2:20, Paul wrote that I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life that I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. Israel wasn't ready to take on the stronghold of Jericho until the Lord took on the strongholds of their hearts. I want to say to you today that spiritual circumcision isn't easy. Going under a surgeon's knife generally isn't. But when the surgeon is God, it's well worth it. Look at verse 9. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Today I have rolled away the shame of your slavery in Egypt." So that place has been called Gilgal to this day. Okay, so that's the key verse I chose. It's the one that's in your bulletins today. Why that verse? Well, you see the beautiful hand of God. You see this grace. But I put it there because of the word Gilgal. See, Gilgal is an interesting word. It's one of those beautiful words. I want to get T-shirts someday that say, "I'm going to Gilgal," and you'll understand why in a second. It's a word that's found no fewer than 39 times in the Bible. It has the same root word as the Hebrew word galal. It sounds a lot like it. Gilgal, I mean, that's how it would look in Hebrew. G-I-L-G-A-L. Galal is G-A-L-L-A-L, and that word literally means roll. I love that galal, that word roll is put here. God has rolled away the sins of the nation. Normally, Gilgal is a term that is used to describe a circle of stones or a circular altar. Archaeologists have found several examples of these along the Jordan River. It's really kind of an interesting thing. In fact, the largest and most famous of the Gilgal stones is the one that you see on the screen right now. This is the Gilgal Rephaim. This is not Gilgal that's talked about in Joshua 5:9, but it gives you an idea of what some of these looked like. This one here is so spectacular that it has been called the Stonehenge of the Levant, or Israel's Stonehenge. The picture, again, that you see isn't the one that we're talking about here. When Jewish folks back in the day would talk about going to Gilgal, they would actually put the word "the" in front of it. In fact, Joshua 5:9 is the only place in Scripture where you don't see the article "the" in front of Gilgal. And so we believe that what we're talking about in Joshua 5:9 is a place that became so significant, is the place where God kind of set the children of Israel in the promised land and did some great work in them, that actually became a city, a town that history has kind of forgotten where it is. Go ahead and get the next slide. There's a map here where we kind of believe that Gilgal is here in the Jordan River area here and on their way to Jericho. The slide you saw before, that is kind of more up here by that city Adam that we talked about earlier. But Israelites would talk about going to the Gilgal like you and me talk about going to the mall. Let's go to the mall. Let's go to the beach. I mean, everybody knew where the Gilgal was in their town. They were all over Israel. Many of the Gilgals discovered near the Jordan River are in the shape of a foot. I don't know if you see that in those top two slides, but there's these stones on the outer edge that kind of look like a foot, and then there's some stones inside the middle of that foot that are the Gilgal stones where they would worship and where the altar was. And it's this incredible thing. Most archaeologists believe that these foot-shaped Gilgals, which are only along kind of this Jordan River promised land area, and date back to the time of Joshua's army coming into the promised land, that these were the ones that were actually built by Joshua's armies everywhere they went. Because what did God say to the people? Every place your feet go, I'm going to give to you. And it was this symbol. It was almost like this Israeli way of saying, in your face, God is with us, all right? And where we've placed our feet, we're going to worship, and that's our Gilgal. And they're only in that region shaped like that. But here's what they represented. Gilgals always represented a place of new beginnings, a place where sin was dealt with, where covenants were restored, and where an army would make a base camp in preparation for a battle against the enemy. And I want to suggest to you this morning that we still need Gilgal moments today. We need a place for God to work in us. We still need the Master's touch. That's what he did in the lives of the Israelites. He touched them with grace and prepared them for what lay ahead. While the Israelites, verse 10 says, were camped at Gilgal on the plains of Jordan, they celebrated the Passover on the evening of the 14th day of the first month. The very next day, they began to eat unleavened bread and roasted grain, harvested where? From the land. No manna appeared on the day after they first ate from the crops of the land, and it was never seen again. So from that time on, the Israelites ate from the crops of Canaan. As the Israelites healed from what one author called their backwoods surgical procedure, they celebrated the Passover. For all we know, this was the first celebration of Passover for this generation, because there is no record of the Israelites celebrating Passover as they were going through the wilderness wanderings. And the Israeli law, the Jewish law, said that they couldn't celebrate the Passover if the men hadn't been circumcised. They celebrated what God was doing in their lives. They celebrated his faithfulness. The manna from heaven ceased falling the day after the Passover celebration. It was in the Passover that they harvested grain in the promised land for the first time. The promises of God were finally coming true. You know, God's promised so many things to us in the Bible, but many of those promises come with a price. We too have to go through a boot camp experience. So to illustrate this point, we're going to end the service different than it looks in your bulletin. Jason and Jessi are going to come up here, and they're going to do a skit called God's Chisel. And there won't be a song afterwards. We're just going to let it speak for itself. So you guys can come on up.
Ephesians 2:10 says we are God's workmanship, his masterpiece. I don't know about you guys, but when I wake up in the morning and I look in the mirror, I don't necessarily see a masterpiece, more like a Picasso. But I would love to be God's masterpiece. I would love to be able to be the person that he created me to be. So I come before him and I say, God, do whatever it takes to mold me into the image of your Son. Make me your masterpiece. In Jesus' name I pray.
Hello.
Who are you?
I'm God.
You're not God.
No, I am. You said the prayer. That's how this whole thing works.
All right. If you're God, make it snow in here.
Well, if I made it snow in here, that'd make everything all yucky. So I'm not going to do that.
You're not God.
Why would you say that?
God wouldn't say yucky.
Oh, no, actually I do. It's a Greek word.
If you're God, what does Lamentations 15:9 say?
Well, Lamentations is actually a pretty short book. It's only got 5 chapters.
Why is it so short?
Well, it's tired of lamenting.
Oh. All right. If you're God, who's going to win the World Series this year?
I'm not so much into playing games, but why are you so into playing games?
You are God.
What gave it away?
You answered my question with a question.
Did I? Oh, yeah, I did it. I do that a lot, don't I? Did it again. All right, yeah, I know. All right, well, step right up. We're going to get started.
Okay.
All right.
What are we doing?
Oh, right. So these are the tools that I'm going to use to form you into my original masterpiece.
Okay.
Yeah. All right.
Hey, I thought you were a carpenter.
Oh, no, that's my son. I know. You confuse really easy. I know. All right. Yeah, we're gonna get started. All right.
Hey, God, how are you going to know which parts to chisel away and which parts to leave?
Oh, well, what I want to do is I'm going to chisel away all the things that don't belong there. So it's kind of like dead weight.
Okay, so speaking of dead weight, right, I have this area here. If you could just focus right here. It's been a problem area ever since I've had kids, okay? It started in the front, and it kind of crept around to the back, and it turned into back fat. I'm not sure why you'd create back fat. But anyway, it's been a problem for me, and I have tried diet, I have tried exercise. My husband brought me to a yoga class. That was awkward. So if you could just take care of that, and then, I don't know, maybe like chisel around the calf area, give me some, defined biceps, that'd be great.
You're funny.
You made me that way.
I also made the platypus. What I'm trying to say is that it's a process, and a lot of my children, they like to talk, but they don't really want to do any of the work. So what's it going to be? Are you going to talk, or can I chisel? Talk, chisel, talk, chisel.
You can chisel, go ahead.
All right, great. So through my Holy Spirit, I'm going to bring up things that I want you to work on, like your anger. Now, I created this emotion, but you use it in the wrong way, and you care more about what other people think of you than what I do. And you tell these little white lies because you're a people pleaser. You're lazy, but you like to look like you're really, really busy. And you have a problem with lust.
No, hey, time out for a second. I don't have a problem with lust.
You don't have a problem with lust?
No, I can lust whenever I want.
Yeah.
Okay, kids, you're doing good work here, and I think we're making a lot of progress. Can we just, stop where we're at?
Well, we are doing good, but when you look out in the mirror, if you're looking in a mirror, what would you see?
I see me.
Right. So I need to keep chiseling because whatever you see and what others see, they need to see my son.
Okay, that's great, but when I start to look more like Jesus, it makes people uncomfortable. Even my church friends, they're like, oh, you're holier than thou. I don't want to make people uncomfortable.
So you would rather play God in certain areas of your life than let me be God over all of your life?
No, that's not what I said.
No, but that's what you meant.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. All right.
Okay, but maybe we can just, take a break, take a little sabbatical from each other, I'll just stay right here.
No, that's the problem. You never stay right here. You're either moving towards me or you're moving away from me. Now, Jess, what you're trying to do here, it's pretty common. It's called controlling. Now, are you going to control or can I chisel? Control, chisel, control,
okay.
Chisel. Okay.
Chisel.
All right.
Chisel.
Okay.
Okay, but can I choose the areas that we chisel?
That's called control. Now, this right here, Jess, this is that secret sin that you have, that you always run to when you're scared or lonely or angry or tired or depressed, and you think you're hiding it from people, but all it does is it turns you into a whitewashed tomb. Are you ready for me to chisel this out of your life? Now, see, this is a process. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. You care so much about what other people think of you, and it's rubbish, it's garbage. What you need to be focused on are the words that you're going to hear from me at the end of your life. When I look at you and I say, well done, good and faithful servant. That's the goal, that's the prize, it's heavenward.
Okay, but it hurts.
Now, trust me, it hurts me a lot more than it hurts you.
Right.
All right.
Okay, but I don't think that you understand the pain and sacrifice.
Don't talk to me about sacrifice. I sent my son to die on a cross for sin and for pain, but I also sent him for another reason. I sent him to give you freedom. Now, do you know what insanity is? Insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting different results. And Jess, you've been going to these things in your life for years, these empty wells that have nothing to offer. You keep going to them and it's insane. Allow me to chisel these things out of your life. Allow me to produce character where you're so focused on your own image.
Okay, but I was thinking...
No, your thoughts are not my thoughts.
Okay, but if we just go a different way...
Your ways are not my ways.
Okay, I can't. Okay, I can't.
You can't what?
I can't be good.
That's your excuse? You can't be good?
It's not an excuse. It's true.
My child, in the beginning, I created everything good. I made you good. Be good.
You of all people should...
Should what?
Nothing.
No. What?
You wouldn't understand.
I, God over the universe, wouldn't understand something that one of my children has to say to me. Try me.
I've let you down so many times.
You were never holding me up. Just I hold you up with my righteous, victorious right hand. Don't forget that in this relationship, I hold you up.
Okay. Chisel. But just be prepared for what you're going to find. Okay? Because I know what's inside. I get up in the morning every day and I look in the mirror and I hate what I see. I get up every morning, this little kid inside of me gets up and puts on adult clothes, goes out into the world, and I try to be good. I try to live up to the expectations that other people have for me, but I can't. Okay, I can't be the person that I want myself to be, let alone the person that you've created me to be, God. I know deep down there's just this stupid little kid, but go ahead, chisel away, just be prepared for what you're going to find.
You have been listening to far too many voices for far too long that aren't mine. You think you're junk, don't you? And when you lay your head down on the pillow at the end of the day, after you've done the dance to get the hug, you think that you're junk. Now just look at me. I don't take time to make junk. How can I show you that my love spans as far as the east is to the west? How can I show you that my love never ends? I've got it. All right, reach in your back pocket.
What?
Reach in your back pocket.
Why?
Are you arguing with me? Reach in your back pocket.
God.
Yes?
I was just saying, God, I will reach into my back pocket.
You were taking my name in vain.
It's a name. It's an expression.
It's more than a name. It's more than an expression. It's the name above all names. And I'm going to teach you something about my name. Reach in your back pocket.
Oh my God. I wrote this in college. How did you get this?
Hello. Read it.
I love Eric.
Other side.
I married him.
I know. I was there.
Dear God, did I hear you right today? Did I hear you say that you love me? Even though you and I both know that I have messed up so many times? Did I hear you say that you want to use me? But I feel so useless. If you'll take me and use me, God, I give you all that I am. Take me. I love you, God.
I love you too. And I love you too much to leave you right where you are. And the salvation that you hold, I don't want it to be some sentimental gush or some head knowledge. I want you to work it out in every detail of your life so that when problems come or chaos happens, that it's not a prison. It's a father disciplining his child, and a father disciplines the one that he loves.
This is hard.
Yeah, but you bought into the lie for some reason that this was going to be easy when you turned your life over to me. Now, there is trouble and problems in this life, but have good cheer. I have overcome the world. I want to show you something. I want you to look out here. And I want you to say, Jessi is God's original masterpiece.
Jessi is...
No. Not the way that you see yourself, and not the way that you fear others see you. The way that I see you.
Jessi is God's original masterpiece.
Yeah, she is.
And so are you. God does not make junk. You are an original masterpiece. So go in peace and serve the Lord.